Our second panel of our conference in the day is entitled Information Security in a Transparent World. And the moderator, Suzanne Spaulding, is the expert in this area, and that's why I contacted her and asked her if she would put together a panel on this very important topic. Suzanne, of course, has testified before Congress. She's written in this area. She's done media in this area. And so this should be a very, very important topic for us, Suzanne. And without saying more, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Scott. And I was very pleased when Scott called and asked me to put together this panel. But not at first. When he first said, I'm thinking about doing a panel on information security, and what would you think about putting together a group on that? And I thought, well, it's really a lot about cybersecurity, and it's in the wake of WikiLeaks. The implication of information security is, how do we do a better job of keeping secrets? And really. When Scott talks about how I'm an expert in this area, it's not quite accurate. But I have been thinking a lot in the last few years, really, about can we keep our secrets? And Scott went on to say that that's exactly why he thought that I would be the right person to moderate this panel, because he thinks those are the right questions to ask. And at that point, I was very pleased. To be able to do this, because I think this is a really important aspect of information security that really has not gotten enough attention. And as I say, the discussion often takes place in the context of cybersecurity, which is one of the most significant threats to information security today, because nearly all of our information resides on the network. And so the vulnerabilities of that network are vulnerabilities to our ability to secure that information. And there's a lot of effort that's taking place in Washington and around the country and around the world to try to improve our ability to somehow protect that cyberspace. And yet, despite all of that effort and energy, we have the WikiLeaks, hundreds of thousands of cables. And documents through first, Afghanistan, Iraq, a few thousand, and then 250,000 cables from the State Department that were handed over to WikiLeaks, only a very tiny percentage of which have been released so far. We have the penetration of Google, and apparently quite a few other companies who face similar penetrations of their systems by a very sophisticated adversary or competitor, or not entirely clear, although the general consensus seems to be that it was the Chinese government. And then we have more recently, we've got lots and lots of instances, but these are just a few that I highlight. Most recently, the company that provides security, information security, for the government and for lots and lots of contractors, and for my law firm of Bingham, McCutchen, RSA, was itself penetrated. That's a little disconcerting. And then we had, I don't know how many of you have gotten emails in the last week or so from vendors with whom you deal, saying, we just want to let you know that your email address may have been, that there was a penetration, and your email address may have been accessed, and so you may be getting emails that appear to come from us, and we need you to be careful. Epsilon, which is a company that provides a service to a lot of companies that all of us interact with, and stores, among other things, our email addresses for them, was penetrated. And so the vulnerabilities in cyberspace are quite evident. A lot of discussion, as I say, about how do we address that threat? And I'm going to put my bias right up front, which is to say that I think ultimately this is largely a losing battle. The folks who are much more technically expert in the area of cybersecurity that I talk to say basically that's correct. If you put your information into the network and you think it's going to be somehow protected from anybody being able to penetrate it, that you're living in a fantasy world. That the only way that you're going to safeguard that information or keep a sophisticated adversary from accessing that information is to smash that computer. Keep that information off the network. And so my push for the last few years has been to try to focus on that reality. How do we get our head around the idea that we really are in an era already where we have far fewer secrets than we think we do? And Don Burke, who has the wonderful title of Intellipedia Doyen at the CIA. Was one of the co-developers of the CIA's version of Wikipedia, which they call Intellipedia. Has been with the agency for many, many years. And he said at a conference a few years ago that in 15 years we will have no more secrets. And that was really sort of what got me going on this notion that, you may not be quite right in the absolutist sense that there will be no more secrets, but the trend line that he's describing it seems to me is exactly right. And if that's the case, it has profound implications for government, for businesses, and for individuals. And ultimately, my sense is that we've got to learn how to deal with that reality, and I make the analogy to training to fight in the dark. If you trained every day to fight in the dark, over time you'd get really good at that, and when you met your adversary, you could either turn off the light or meet your adversary in the dark, and you would prevail. I think we need to be training to fight in the light. The transparent world, whether we want it or not, is fast approaching. And we need to be figuring out how we compete more effectively and operate in that world rather than so much focus on how do we keep more secrets. Having said that, we've got a panel here of people who, at least two of them, have spent much of their careers working hard to protect essential secrets of the intelligence community. And so they bring a very interesting perspective on this. And I was really pleased that they agreed to be here today to talk about this. And then we've got our third panelist who spent his career trying to find out those secrets and bring them to light. And so he also brings a very interesting perspective on this. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then let them talk make some opening remarks, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion up here, and then we'll open it up. And I hope we will have provoked enough to generate an interesting discussion here. So our first panelist is John MacGaffin. John is a senior advisor to the National Director for Counterintelligence, who is the head of counterintelligence for the Director of National Intelligence. So again, somebody who's supposed to be focused on trying to protect our secrets against foreign intelligence services. He also comes out of a long career at the CIA, where he served as chief of station of 4 different places abroad, which he was the head of CIA activities in Russia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and then he was the number 2 in charge of all the spies at CIA, the deputy director for operations at CIA. He then left the CIA and did what would have been unthinkable just a couple years before that, and in fact was sort of shocking even at the time, and went to work at the FBI. And so those of you who understand that, the tension between CIA and FBI, will be amazed to learn that he was asked by the director of FBI, Louis Freeh at the time, to come over and be a senior advisor for him. And where he did some really important work on understanding where we needed to go with counterintelligence in the future. He was asked then, most recently by the former DNI, Denny Blair, to work on a DNI review group on counterintelligence and where we work together. looking at how can we improve counterintelligence going forward and what should its role be in the intelligence community. So we're really pleased to have John here to talk with us. Next to John is Joel Brenner. Joel also comes out of the most recently, his most recent federal service was in the counterintelligence realm as the head of counterintelligence for the DNI. He was the National Counterintelligence Executive. He has been a senior counsel at NSA just before going into private practice here, but he was also Inspector General at the NSA from 2002 to 2006. And he spent some time early on in the Justice Department. Joel is a member of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security, which Scott is very active with, and Bobby and a number of other folks here. He is now of counsel to Cooley law firm, and is working on global risk management, information security, and internal investigations. And he has a book coming out, which I would be remiss not to mention, which is entitled America the Vulnerable, New Technology and the National Security. And then our third panelist is Walter Pincus. And Walter Pincus has worked for virtually every major media outlet in the country. He started as a copy boy with the New York Times before joining the Army, where he served with the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps. So there's a theme here that you can see. He's also worked over the years with the Wall Street Journal, with the Washington Star. Those of you who lived in Washington for a long time will remember that publication, the Washington Post, the New Republic, NBC News, CBS News. He covered the Watergate hearings, but he also spent some time, took sabbaticals from the Washington Post and spent some time working as congressional staffer for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when it was chaired by William Fulbright, and did some very interesting work actually on the Hill, which maybe he'll talk about. He's won numerous prizes, including the George Polk Award and an Emmy. And he was given the Stuart Alsop Award by the Association of Foreign Intelligence Officers for his coverage of national security affairs. He's now, among other things, a visiting fellow and lecturer at Yale College. So John, start with you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Can you hear me all right? I want to focus initially on the security of information that belongs to the U.S. government, national security related information. First, because that's what I know most about, and also because of the current focus on things that Suzanne mentioned of WikiLeaks. The other equally important part of information security and how we deal with it, the private sector, academia, and elsewhere, we're going to cover as well, and Suzanne and Joel particularly I've done some really interesting work on this area, but I'm going to confine myself primarily to the notion of efforts to steal our most critical national security information, to steal or to lose it. And I'll start by acknowledging what I'm sure you're going to hear from everyone in this panel, and would hear from anyone who thought about the problem for more than 15 seconds, and that is the U.S. government has much more information than it needs. It regularly declares as classified volumes of information a day, then tries to protect it much more than it should. So some of it should never have been classified in the first place. Some of it was classified at the time, legitimately so, and is no longer, time has expired, it's no longer of interest. But the U.S. government clearly continues to try to protect it, and it's clearly, as we've seen in everything from WikiLeaks to the work of Mr. Pincus and others, is unable to do so. Joel Brenner is going to give us, I think, some thoughts on the various attempts at information security in the recent past and why they have all failed for one reason or another. The problem of too much classified information has been with us for a long time. And while the total amount of this accumulation continues each year, I'm not sure that the criteria for classification has gotten less stringent in the recent past. I'm not entirely sure of that, but I think that it's not that the people in government aren't aware of this mass of accumulating classified data, but the problem is more of rote classification than it is of consciously making the problem worse. It is pervasive, and that's all we know. The problem is not new. It may not be any worse from that last aspect, but what is new and what is much worse than ever before is for the problem of information security, whether it's legitimate or illegitimately classified, comes from two aspects. First, after 9/11, the government, with the realization that there are things here we should have known, could have known if we paid attention or properly dispersed, there's been the notion, the mantra of information sharing at the classified level of information on classified information systems has taken quite properly the town by storm, and people constantly are in the information sharing mode. And that contributes to the problems we're going to discuss today. And the other element of that is the increasing use of information security, information systems to communicate the new urge the new need to share more broadly. So both of these, they're indeed welcome, both the push to sharing and the enhanced use of tools and networks to share. But as always, the devil is in the detail and in the application. Suzanne mentioned the National Counterintelligence Review Group that we both served on in 2009, and there were some 6 or 7, 8 of us who probably had a gazillion years of intelligence and counterintelligence experience among us. And the seminal moment came when we had a briefing from a participant, for an outsider, who described the extent to which our government then knew about attempts to penetrate classified networks. And we all went home. It was a Friday. We came back on Monday, and we all had been thinking the same things, like we had no idea how serious the problem was. We've all been involved in national security issues for our entire careers, and all of us came saying this is much, much worse than we thought, that the penetration of our classified national security information was beyond anything we could have imagined. The shorthand we sort of developed in that was the two worst spies in recent past were, as you probably recall, Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen. One worked at the CIA, for me. That shows why I've managed to become high in counterintelligence. I didn't catch him. And the other, Robert Hansen, worked for the FBI. The mantra we came out of this conference, of this review group, was that the damage done by Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen pales in comparison to the information that's already been stolen from us by foreign intelligence service and foreign governments already in the world of cyber, which we saw as the cyber for the shorthand of information systems and classified information, already pales, and the prospects are that it will get only worse and worse. So since I've been involved in the WikiLeaks problem from the start, let me use that as an example of part, but only part of the problem of the challenges of information security today. Private Bradley Manning, the alleged perpetrator here, has become a cult hero to groups who oppose classifying information in any circumstance by any government. In sort of an ironic way, he's become a hero, in quotes, to those of us who worry about the problem, because it's the only way we're going to get, we believe, the kind of attention that we need to staunch this flow and to cope with, and we'll discuss this later, the balance that Suzanne is discussing here. WikiLeaks, as Suzanne said, more than 250,000 classified documents in a State Department owned and operated database. 70 different government agencies' documents and secrets were in there, so it wasn't just a State Department problem. Everyone got to go down with the same ship. Only a small portion of them have been released. We're still, I think, in single-digit percentages of those documents, although newspapers and other sources around the world have the full 250,000 document cache. They've, adhering to their agreement with WikiLeaks, Mr. Assange and others, to release them in an orchestrated and gradual basis. So the problem's going to be with us for years. You will wake up 5 years from now and there'll be a new expose as whatever the problem of the day is, these will come out to demonstrate what America said, did, and relative to those to that subject. The damage done so far touches a wide range of U.S. interests. Ambassadors have been expelled, recalled. Important projects with foreign governments have been canceled or postponed. Individuals have been moved urgently out of their own country to protect them from possible reprisals, including death, because of the impact of what's now known about them. So who's to blame? Many, many more people than I suspect you would imagine. The State Department, in my view, is the major offender. They never fully thought out what sort of information should reasonably be served up for broad distribution, which gets to Suzanne's point of how do you think about what ought to be a secret. They never took any, they're really delinquent in having had no real measures of trying to control access in this classified network. We're not talking about the internet, we're talking classified U.S. government networks. They never tried to really control access to them. Individual State Department officers were never schooled in how do you think about what to put into this database or not. The consequence was just mindless rote, pass it on. Defense Department shares the burden. Private Bradley Manning should have never had access to this information that had nothing to do with his job, number one. And number two, he was known to his employers as a very disgruntled employee. Suzanne pointed out to me, should all the people who were disgruntled be denied access to information? But 4 days a week, I wouldn't have access, I guess, to information. But the point was, he was disgruntled in an interesting way. He was at an army outpost outside of Baghdad, a few people, dangerous area, and the military found his behavior so difficult and disruptive, they took away his gun. That's a clue, I think. And then they said he could only work at night because he disrupted other people. So he worked at night and stole documents at night. So and he said he was listening to Lady Gaga, and he would bring in discs and plug them in and mouth the words as he was downloading thousands of documents. They thought he was singing to Lady Gaga. So there's a lot of blame to go around, and I'll tell you more about that. Anyway, as painful and difficult as the WikiLeaks problem has been, it represents only a small portion of the problem of information security relative to classified U.S. government information. Most people fail to recognize when you tell the WikiLeaks story that it has nothing to do with an adversary, foreign adversary. It has nothing to do with foreign intelligence services. Just one disgruntled employee in a news service who would take his stuff. Just think, if you added an adversary foreign intelligence service to the mix, you have an order of magnitude increase in the damage that could be done to us. Foreign governments certainly can read, as these things are put up on the net and elsewhere, they can read the documents as they're rolled out by WikiLeaks. But that pales in comparison to the damage that a trained intelligence service would do when they were able to acquire certain sorts, even appropriately classified information, if they could acquire it at their own initiative, the information of their own choice, and do it in a manner such that we didn't know that it had gone missing, the secrets had gone missing. Think how dangerous that is, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So you can see that presents a much greater problem than that posed by the disgruntled sergeant. That's not the worst of it yet. The first of this latter loss of sort of loss by the disgruntled employee to an adversary operating in secret takes place with that by a disgruntled employee takes place less frequently than the loss of information to a foreign intelligence service. Bradley Mannings are less frequent offenders than intelligence services in stealing our information. Walter Pincus's ability to acquire information of classified things, while annoying to some of us at the time, again, is a less serious problem in terms of volume and things that eat at us than those activities done secretly by intelligence services. That's still not the worst of it. If we got serious about what information we chose to classify, Suzanne's point, and if we spent the dollars on it to fix classified information systems, we could significantly improve our ability to protect against the disgruntled employee, and probably to a lesser extent from Walter's sources. But technical fixes, mousetraps on information systems, will never, ever eliminate the threat from a technically advanced, determined intelligence service, built by man, defeated by man. and if you replace the disgruntled employee by a skilled human spy inside the system, inside the organization, inside the system, controlled by an intelligence service, the damage will be absolutely catastrophic and unavoidable. Just imagine if Private Manning had been a controlled Russian or Chinese spy. He'd still be stealing the information. We still wouldn't know it. The harsh reality then is not so much that we have declared a secret much more than we have that meets the test. More importantly, the danger to our governance, to our policymakers, to our military interests and economic interests. We have fewer secrets than we believe we had, as Suzanne said. The important point here is the fatal trap, when we operate, as we do every day, and the unchallenged belief that our secrets are ours and ours alone. How stupid and dangerous is that? But that's the way we operate. So the task today, particularly when we get to the discussion portion of this panel, is for you all to help us figure out how we fix this, because we're not doing very well on our own. Clearly, owning up to the overclassification problem is a necessary first step. Technical mousetraps on classified systems, even if they do not stop the sophisticated spy, will go a long way, and a lot of money is being thrown at that problem. But to close, what else can we do? How far is it possible to reduce what is truly reasonably secret? Would a smaller number of real secrets make them easier to protect? How would you do that? The ancient Persians tried to solve the problem by a system known as the wazir's ears. That is, anything really secret was whispered from one wazir into the ear of another. That would be a pretty hard way to handle really secret elements of a military campaign, but it would certainly actually improve the quality of national security debates in Washington.
Thank you, John. Joel?
I'm hearable out there, is that good? I'm going to come at the same problem set from a very different angle and explain why, in my view, as a public, as a country, we're thinking about this in a rather shallow way. The fundamental problem is that information is liquid and that liquid leaks. This is a problem at every level: personal security, corporate security, and national security. I think the idea is abroad in the land that privacy is going to hell in a handbasket and that secrecy is out of control. And it's foolishness. Privacy is to persons what secrecy is to governments. Everybody in every organization has certain things they'd rather some other persons not know. And we have different rules and should have different rules about what applies to persons and to governments especially. But the fundamental problem is the same at every level, because you, your employer, and your government all communicate on the same technological backbone, using the same commercial off-the-shelf stuff, and we all behave pretty much the same way in our jobs as we do at home. So the set of cultural proclivities that drive our inclination toward openness, and we are not a distrusting society. That's one of our great strengths. Counterintelligence is done much better in distrustful, closed cultures than it is in the United States. But privacy is to persons what secrecy is to organizations. And to make matters even more difficult, the information security or insecurity and operational security and insecurity have converged because, and this gets much too little public attention, the same keyboard that I use to write this, for example, is the keyboard on the same kind of computer that controls lots of our industrial control systems. If you can penetrate a computer system in order to take information out of it, you can also penetrate it in order to take that system down or corrupt the information that's in it. So we have arrived at a juncture in our history and culture when information security and operational security are now pretty much in almost every large realm the same. Now, efforts to remediate the problem and the public's understanding of the problem, especially as it relates to personal and commercial life, which is what I'm going to focus on for a minute, having spent quite a long time with the issues that John was describing, are focused on two principles, both based on a theory that equates privacy, that focuses, I think, unduly on privacy, and that equates privacy with a theory of data security and assumes largely that security and privacy are fundamentally at odds, when in my view, unless we have secure systems, you can't have privacy. They may be at odds in certain circumstances, but they're not fundamentally different sets of issues. Now, the first principle we rely on as a culture in dealing with this problem is the principle of disclosure. I'm being descriptive here. I'm not arguing with it, because trying to substantively regulate how we disclose information, we wouldn't know how to do it. We wouldn't know how to do it. But it has led us to a culture in which all of us get 3 to 5 times a week a lengthy document that describes how our bank, our grocery store, our university, and everything else handle our information, and we all do the same thing with it all the time. We throw it away without reading it. It also produces these pop-ups that you get, which are really actually a travesty. My favorite is, when I wrote this, Apple would, you get on your, you'll download a song or something on iTunes, and you get a 55-page, it's now 57-page pop-up. And you'd have to read this, scroll through 57 pages of stuff. Now, nobody does that. So there is on page 1 an I agree button. This is beyond satire, folks. This is a travesty. This is the reality to which our way of thinking about it and our laws have driven us. In fact, you don't really get disclosure. What these disclosures do is provide a license to the party that's disclosing it, and it insulates it from liability for whatever they're doing. The corollary of this principle is our opt-out rule. In theory, if we were 18th century thinkers, we'd see no difference between, rational people would not distinguish between an opt-out and an opt-in rule, but of course we know that behaviorally this is absolutely nonsense, and that the difference between an opt-out rule, you all know what I'm talking about here, I take it. If you don't want your provider to do certain things, you have to jump through some hoops to tell it not to do that. In an opt-in rule, they can't do it unless you affirmatively indicate that you want it done. There are some real difficulties in administration as to when an opt-in rule really turns out to be an opt-out rule. But this isn't likely to change in our country, where the data industry is worth billions and billions and billions, and is extremely powerful. I don't see this changing. But the result is that we have a scheme that's really good for class action lawyers and members of the printers union, but is having absolutely no effect on the size and growth of the sea of information in which we swim, or on targeted advertising, whether you think that's good or bad, or on the security of personal information. We're engaging, in other words, in a kind of charade. It's a sandbagging operation against the sea of data, and we're out front of the front door laying sandbags, and actually the data is flowing in over the windowsill, and we are accomplishing fundamentally nothing with this legal scheme. The second principle on which we rely so heavily is personally identifiable information, in some state statutes just called personal information. This is the basis of virtually all our privacy legislation, and it once made sense. It's becoming increasingly untenable, however, because of the ease with which people can be de-anonymized with classes of data that have nothing to do with your name, address, telephone number, social security number, and such like. In California, well, we know that with 33 bits of information, virtually anybody on the planet can be identified. They're rapidly heading into a world in which anonymity is basically anonymity is a myth. And it is not functionally, we're not quite there yet, because it's much easier to identify somebody from their name, if you have their name, address, and phone number, than if you just know the make of the car, where they shop, what subway station they get on and off at certain times of day, and so on, with that kind of information. But you can do it with that kind of information. Now, against that background, last month, the California Supreme Court decided a case called Panetta versus Williams-Sonoma, in which it decided that a zip code was personally identifiable information. largely on the theory that I've just laid out for you. And there are European privacy theorists who have taken that position for some time. But that presents us with the question of where that's going to stop. Because if I can also identify myself with the fact that I drive a certain kind of Ford that I bought in a certain year, and that I get on the subway at 8:30 every morning in a certain place, and that I really shop at a certain, with data like that, then the question we're really faced with is whether the category of personally identifiable information has not been rendered meaningless. Either it includes everything or it includes nothing, in which case, either way, it's a meaningless category. And I don't think we've had any public discussion of this fact. All of our privacy laws are based on this conception, which I think is being, I'm put it to you, being quickly rendered unintelligible in the literal sense. Looking at this line of cases at the legislative history of the statutes, what we really see is a large edifice, a legal edifice, supported now by lawyers like me and accountants. This is good for me. This is really good for me, having these. We do a lot of data breach work at Cooley. But what's at risk here with somebody's zip code at Williams-Sonoma? I know what was at stake for the class action lawyers that brought that case, but most people, especially under the age of 35, don't mind targeted advertising. And what we're really dealing with here is hostility to targeted advertising. Soon, we need to confront, at a fundamental level, the way our privacy legislation works. Both the PII and the disclosure principle are based on a notion of privacy that I think is, for reasons that Jeffrey Rosen says so nicely, that are like, compared to past generations on this planet, it's like skim milk to heavy cream, or as the Mexicans say, like water for chocolate. We've reduced it to a subset of electrical engineering, and it's all data control. It's not only a paltry view of privacy, but it's an unsatisfactory view of data control. Around 1700, a man named Russell invented a toy for the Duke of Orrery. It was the cat's meow of the day. It was a mechanical model of the solar system. I mean, really a wonderful thing at the end of the 17th century. And you could see how all the planets and all the orbits interact, how they moved. Our theory of privacy as data control is like an orrery theory of information. As if we could take pieces of information that are heavy, clunky like planets and put them in an orbit and they'd stay there. And that I could elect, I want this in the orbit of Mars, I want that in the orbit of Jupiter, this stuff I don't care about. And this stuff that I've put in this orbit is going to stay there. Information isn't like that. It's not like planets. It's like comet dust. And it's everywhere. And there's no such thing as one copy of it anyway. When you go through a line at the grocery store and you swipe your credit card, there are 6 or 7 places, at least 6 in this country, at least 7 if you're abroad, where that information is going and where it's stored, or at least temporarily. So this is dust. And our notion that it's going to behave like the planet Jupiter and be in a predictable orbit is foolishness. A corollary of this theory of the way our laws work, especially in Europe, though to some extent here too, is that the purpose for which information is gathered determines its permissible use. This has created terrible problems in terrorist tracking, for example, as Paul Rosenzweig knows real well, because he helped Stuart Baker write a terrific book that I really recommend, called Skating on Stilts, which really takes us through this. It doesn't work. I gather this information for purposes of flying on an airline, not for purposes of tracking terrorists, so the airline can't give it to me. I want to say, I think future generations are going to look back at this kind of effort to regulate information, at least on the optimistic theory that we have democracies and free thinking in future years, and see this as an attempt to regulate the permissible uses of information, like we did in the Middle Ages. It's an effort to impose ignorance, and it's very troublesome. We're missing the boat, friends, in our focus, in the culture's focus on credit card data and such. Those are serious issues. I don't want to belittle the significance of having rules about the way information like that, personal information, is handled. But this is not fundamentally the problem the nation's facing right now. The basic issue is data security at all levels. The privacy problem is fundamentally behavioral. We're facing relentless attacks on the intellectual property of American companies. The Google attack didn't involve 30-some companies. Big revelation a few weeks after the Google story first broke. 30-some companies. There's several thousand companies that have been penetrated in this way. And now, as Suzanne says, we've got we don't know how successful the RSA attack has been, because RSA has played the cards very close to its vest in this encryption issue. We've also had very little public discussion or understanding of the fact that what makes so many of these attacks possible is the use of botnets, which is the ability to enslave other people's machines and have them do work for us without our knowing it. When I started writing my book, the biggest botnet I'd ever heard of was 10,000 machines. It's now at least 100,000. Some people claim for the Zeus that it's really 1 million, but that's not one botnet. 100,000 machines that you tell to send out spam or steal information or put malware in other people's machines. Just on the law of averages, this is what makes possible staged attacks on governments and companies as well as persons, and makes them very difficult to trace and to attribute. The result of all this is transparency at every level. It's transparency for you and me in ways that we're uncomfortable with. It's transparency for corporate trade secrets, for engineering drawings that take millions of dollars to produce, algorithms that are worth billions of dollars. This stuff is now porous, it's vulnerable, it's leaking. And it's mostly, not entirely going to China, but China is without a doubt the biggest perpetrator of this. And then it affects us in the government, because the government uses the same technology we all do. We are living in an increasingly transparent world, one in which, not that there will be no secrets, as Suzanne says, but which fewer and fewer things can be kept secret and will stay secret. Their shelf life, their half-life, will get shorter and shorter and shorter.
If there's any proof that I'm a generation past, it's listening to all the invasion of cyberspace and the threats they face. It got me thinking back to the fact that I started off my career really writing for 3 North Carolina papers as their Washington correspondents after I got out of the Army, and learned all my lessons there. I mean, the first major story I ever produced was about the Democratic committeeman of North Carolina who was making money off taking a fee for helping get contracts down in Fayetteville on the Army base. And I found out about it by reading tax court records. He got caught up in the tax court. And the U.S. tax court publishes transcripts of their cases along with your tax return. So you could actually see somebody's tax return. The second quote scoop I had was that they decided to pick the air base at Goldsboro, North Carolina, for a B-52 bomber unit, which changed Goldsboro totally. It had been published in a hearing on construction that was published by the House a week after after this closed hearing. And they left it in a list, and I wrote about it. And that was a big story. So I became an avid reader of hearings. And then I kept track of tobacco for the Durham paper. And because I had written about the details of a tobacco bill, it was isolating how many acres you could have and what the subsidy would be. I actually got the White House to tell me ahead of time that President Eisenhower was going to veto the tobacco bill. And those three instances just talked me into the fact that there's a huge amount of information floating around Washington 40 years ago that people weren't reading. And I mean, that's sort of the basis of my career, whatever it is, and that is reading things. And to bring it up to date, I used to go cover wars, but when Iraq came up and then Afghanistan, my theory is when you go to a war zone, you have to be able to run, because the military, but they give you a protection force, so because I couldn't run, they'd be protecting, I'd be endangering everybody else. So I covered the war from Washington, and the way I covered the war was by reading contracts. Every government contract, for the most part, is published. There used to be something called Commerce Business Daily. It's now online. I've learned how to use online. And I mean, I'd sit here today and tell you we now have a video in an aerostat 3,000 feet above Afghanistan in no less than 180 places that can see a person and make him identifiable 2.5 miles away. And I read it in a contract. It's quite stunning. I wrote a whole series of stories about how much we were building in Afghanistan because they had to put the building solicitations out over the past few years. You could see the buildup, and in fact, just recently they put out a contract hastening the construction of over $5 billion more of police stations, army bases for the Afghan army, et cetera, that won't be completed till after 2014, which is the day we're supposed to be leaving. AID just put out a contract for somebody, for a contractor, to help boost the provincial governments in Iraq. And it's a 5-year contract for us to kind of remake the Iraq provincial government system, because we want Iraq to be more of a federal country than a centralized country, because we fear another Saddam Hussein. Whether Mr. Maliki agrees with that or not is something else again. But by reading contracts, you get an insight on what the government's thinking and where they're thinking of going, and it's all public. It also works in an odd way. One of the more interesting contracts we have is to supply jet fuel to a base we run in Kyrgyzstan. And this is a contract that was worth maybe $15 or $20 million a year when it began, but as we increased our activities in Afghanistan, and particularly flying what you do from Kyrgyzstan, is we then based a lot of tankers there. And those tankers refuel the fighter planes that are working over Afghanistan. The contract went from $15 million to $200 million a year. And the company that won it was called the MENA Corporation, which had an office in Gibraltar, which was just a mailbox. And so we started inquiring about who the MENA Corporation is. It turns out it's the same central group called Red Star, which is even a cleverer name since it's all Russian fuel, which is also out of the same post office box in Gibraltar, and which was supplying all of the jet fuel that went into Bagram Air Base. Nobody would tell us. I mean, this was a bid, it was an open contract. And I started inquiring as to who Red Star is. And this is the secret. The ownership of this company, according to the Defense Logistics Agency, was a commercial secret. Now, we have a bunch of acts that say you can't trade with the Iranians. And we also have some acts that say you can't buy this kind of material, military material, from the Russians. I was convinced it was my friend Mr. MacGaffin's former people doing it, because in order to buy this fuel, you had to have a huge chain of facilities. You had to work out buying the jet fuel. You had to work out transporting it from wherever you were buying it. And they had to use both, they were doing it by ships across the Caspian Sea, and then they had to have trucks, dozens of trucks to carry it. So it was a huge infrastructure. And the one thing suddenly leaked out was that they gave me the name of the person who was the operating officer, who turned out to be the former military attaché in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. If you follow Kyrgyzstan closely, there have been 2 overthrows of government for corruption. And the central issue in the corruption were the contracts involved with this provision of jet fuel. So who these people were was terribly important, and it was considered a great classified secret until, and even Congress was told originally that they couldn't find out about it. And then suddenly they did release it about 5 months ago. It's the former owner of a bar in Kyrgyzstan. So I still don't believe we know who owns and who's doing it all. So that's a secret that's really been kept. The other part is how to, Suzanne asked me to cover 3 events, 3 kinds of things, and they're all anecdotal. You get anecdotes, being a generation older than the previous panel. We all live in the past. Previous classified events you find out because you know people for a long time. And meetings take place, and then people want to get either their side of the story out, or they want to contradict a public story that's been put out that they know to be untrue. Or most of them just want to either say they were there at the meeting to prove something, or they want to make you think that they were at the meeting, which makes them more important. The thing that most people don't understand when we deal with classified information like this is that we always check, and I'm now talking about the Post and the Times and the major newspaper. I won't deal with bloggers because I just, they live by their own rules. But we always check with the government. So the government has a chance to put in their complaint, or they're trying to straighten us out if we're wrong, or they try to cover up if we're right. But we always give them a chance when it comes to classified information to make their case about publication or why it would damage national security. And we go through these exercises quite a bit. And oftentimes, we go ahead and print things. And an equal amount of times, or on a few occasions, it has you end up either with the head of an agency coming to see the editor of the Post, or in a few cases, over the years and recently, the reporter and the editor go to the White House and let the president make the case. In the most recent publicized one of those, when Dana Priest published the so-called Black Prisons Abroad, we agreed that we would not name the countries because you could see the obvious reaction it would cause. So we didn't. And of course, the next day, some blogging group published the names of the countries. And then the Post got beaten up for sort of covering up for some reason. So it's a great sort of internal battle. But essentially, the one thing about classified events and classified material is that the Post always checks with the government and listens to the government's argument. This whole question of national security and protecting national security, and as John said, what ought to be classified in the old-fashioned sense. I guess I go back to the fact of what's open and what's closed these days, and then what ought to be classified. In the 1960s, Suzanne said, I ran 2 investigations for Senator Fulbright, one on foreign government lobbying and one on the military and foreign policy, which it was essentially an investigation in the Vietnam War. And we did country by country, or in the first case, lobbyist by lobbyist, in closed session, and then we went through the process of clearing and publishing transcripts. And the first time we did a country and the American military involvement in that country was in 1969, and we were going to publish a transcript of a closed hearing on the Philippines, which we had about American military involvement in the Philippines, what we had there, how it related to the Vietnam War, etc. I was in charge of the declassification. If you work for Fulbright to show how everything's different, the investigating committee staff to investigate American military involvement in foreign policy was myself and a lawyer. If you ran an investigation for Senator Fulbright, you did it with one other person so that you can control the whole investigation. And we had been to the Philippines. It's the other part of what he believed in. We went to every country that we investigated or that we looked into. And then, I must admit it was my idea we then brought back the people we talked to and put them under oath. The traditional habit was to bring in the assistant secretary, but we were dealing with details, and the senator had been through it enough that if you tried to get detailed facts laid on the record on something like that, the assistant secretary would say he didn't know what the facts were. And you get generalized and they'd supply it for the record, so you sort of lose what you were trying to do. So we brought the people back. And in the midst of the Philippine hearing, because there was a lot of testimony about stealing and on bases and the role of the then president of the Philippines, Senator Fulbright at one point said President Marcos is a crook. That became a real issue for classification because the State Department wanted to classify it. There were about 10 other items that we couldn't, I had to negotiate, which gave me my view of classification, because things would come back classified. And then depending on who you were arguing with, and they sent me somebody from the Pentagon and somebody from the State Department, sometimes you'd find out there were different standards, and sometimes they would not know that the same information had been published a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, or a year earlier. So we negotiated, and I think it was roughly almost half of the material that they wanted to classify was declassified in the negotiation. We then had sort of 10 items. And it's one of the great anecdotes of your experience that I went through. Senator Symington was chairman of the subcommittee because he was on armed services. Senator Fulbright wanted somebody on armed services to chair it, but he was also on foreign relations. So Senator Symington was the chairman of the subcommittee, and we had 10 items, and we had them wrapped in a book, and he had studied the book, and he was prepared because we had an appointment with Secretary of State William Rogers. And it was scheduled for a Saturday morning, and Senator Symington and I went over, and we were in a conference room, and Secretary Rogers came in his tennis outfit, which somehow gave you a feeling about this, how important he thought the meeting was. And he was an old friend of Senator Symington. And along with him was a team of two ambassadors that I had negotiated with. And we sat down, it was very formal. Senator Symington was a very formal character. And he had his book open, he had studied it, and he said, Secretary Rogers, on item number 1, here's our argument, whereupon Secretary Rogers turned and pointed to an ambassador and said, explain to Senator Symington, explain to Stewart, Senator Symington, what our position is, whereupon Symington surprised them and really surprised me by saying, wait a minute, I came here to negotiate with you. And if you haven't taken the time to study the issues and to study the arguments, I think we'll just make up our own minds. And he closed the book, stood up, and we walked out. And we published what we wanted to publish. And the world didn't come to an end. But it was a great lesson about classification. And that's always stuck with me. And I think it still exists during today. I'll add one other thing, which is to hear about WikiLeaks. There are 250,000 cables, and less than 3,000 have come out. But they go back to 1966, and I can tell you from a press point of view, having sat in on our discussions about it, the chances that they're going to get much beyond 5,000 are very slim. They're very boring to write about, and it takes time to read them. We've gone through this weird discussion about WikiLeaks being a journalistic enterprise. It is no different than reading tax court records or whatever. They used to be a journalistic enterprise, but then they fell into this, for them, a gold mine of material. And so they lured first other publications into it to make these ridiculous agreements, and then let us compete with ourselves, but also let us compete with the rest of the people. And Assange, if nothing else, has really learned what the government learned years ago, what Congress has learned in shorter time, how to manipulate us. We are so manipulable, it is quite frightening. And one of my pets is you don't need sophisticated things. You just need reporters who want to go look at records, because my basic theme is no different than it was back in the 50s, and that is there's a huge amount of information available for reporters to read that's in the open. People don't realize that, and if they have the ability, and this is sort of old person's talk, they have the ability and the experience to know what's important and to be able to put it in context with current events, you'll end up telling people and giving people facts that they ought to have, And then they can sit and listen to the blabbing back and forth, because what's happened is, as I teach at Stanford now and teach my students, we are now in a PR society in which government and Congress has learned how to manipulate what comes out in public. And what you see is reporting of inaccurate facts, because politicians have learned that they can't be contradicted except by the other side, which is another sort of downside of my profession. We hate to say somebody said X and it's wrong, because that implies you, the reporter, have taken a side against whoever said it. And so what you're getting now is the press, and I've written it and gotten in trouble for it, the press has become more of a common carrier than a reporter of facts, a common carrier of what people say. And we hopefully are going to get back to putting the facts underneath what people say, and giving the public a chance to work from a basic set of facts and then determine arguments that are true or false. I'll quit at that.
Thank you, Walter. So we started by talking about the challenges in terms of information security and keeping secrets that are presented by technology in terms of the vulnerabilities of cyberspace and the network. But one of the reasons that I really wanted to have Walter here was to bring the other side of the information security challenge, which is, in fact, the amount of information that is out there in the open. And so the part of the notion of secrecy is that you somehow have a monopoly on that information which you think you're keeping secret. And part of what we're realizing, and technology is helping most people, Walter is actually patient enough to sit and read through all of the contracts that come out, but for people who are less patient, they can do word searches and using technology find all kinds of information. And the amount of information that's out there in the open source has in fact created a whole new kind of intelligence called open source intelligence. It has its own acronym, OSINT, I don't know how it's pronounced, OSINT. And the interesting thing to me, and one of the, is that this is an entity within the intelligence community that scans the open source, the amount of information that's out there in the open world, using sophisticated technologies and analysts, et cetera, pulls together all kinds of interesting information, and then it gets stamped classified. Information that is pulled completely off of the open source network.
It's done in a classified location.
And is done inside of an expensive classified environment, is then marked classified. And we think somehow that nobody else is going to be able to find that information out there in the open world. Walter's colleague, Dana Priest, he mentioned her secret prisons piece, which was based on getting access to very sensitive classified information, but she subsequently did a piece called Top Secret Enterprise, in which she provided remarkable detail about the scale of the national security enterprise just in the DC area, where all the buildings were, how many people worked in them, how many entities were working on the various issues, et cetera, all of which she gathered through open source, and all of which the government, much of which the government considers sensitive or secret. So that's another side of the challenge. So we've spent a lot of time talking about this notion that it's increasingly hard to keep information secure. And the question that I would pose to each of you is, okay, so what do we do about it? What is to be done? John?
As I said in my remarks, I think the only place you can possibly start is a notion, unless you're willing to go, as I don't even think you are, to there will be a world in which there will be no secrets, even though we did a wonderful workshop on that. I think you've got to start from the position that there are things that will remain secret, particularly for governments. I'll leave my colleagues to do the non-government side of it. For governments, if you acknowledge there are things that, at least for a certain piece of time, period of time must remain secret. Your specific negotiating strategy, or your particular your bottom line when you go to talk to, whatever those things are. You're going to start by rigorously examining those, and it's going to be hard work, but in all categories of military, economic, the whole range of things, try to identify what those are that everyone would agree absolutely must not be stolen or known for a period of time. Only when you've done that can you sort through the rest of this. So that's where I'd start.
Yeah. Joel?
Yeah, I have an answer in a couple of different ways. On the WikiLeaks thing, we've talked about this a lot. Trying to deal with that by clamping down on the Walter Pincuses of the world is just foolishness. The focus has to be on what goes in, not what you do when stuff comes out. And I'm just going to repeat now what you've said, John. I'm going to package it in a different way. Unless you propose to share everything with everybody, you've got to have criteria to tell you what you're going to share and with whom. This is the nature of the problem. Now, what we had before 9/11 was, I think it's not too much to say, systematic abuse of need to know between the agencies. But in order to, that meant that people would not share things with another agency because they didn't need to know it, and that was the rationale, whether it was done in good faith or not. That was abusive. That's an ongoing problem, the tendency of bureaucracies to be turf-oriented. But to pretend that the need-to-know problem has gone away produces directly the WikiLeaks issue. You've got to decide that, at an extreme case, that a private first class in a war theater in Central Asia doesn't need to know what the Icelandic ambassador to Reykjavik is saying about the Icelandic economy. That's a no-brainer. Now, there are going to be some that are harder. And is there going to be some risk that somebody who did need to know something and could have used it won't get it? Sure. But you got to balance that against this other kind of massive risk, because we're dealing now not with retail leaking. We're dealing with wholesale and mass leaking. So that's one issue. We focus always, this information sharing has become a slogan. The problem is information management. And by the way, the government in this respect is developing in a way that's contrary to what I think is the tendency in corporate life. The government tags information at various levels of secrecy, and it tags persons at various levels as to their access to that information. We tag people, we tag information. That's foreign to corporate culture, except in some very isolated areas, like in especially now that we've got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, we have rules that wall off trading desks, for example, from certain research that's done from the M&A group in an investment bank. And quarterly results have been closely held and so forth. But except for some isolated issues like that, the idea that you allow some people in the company to access only some things has been foreign. That's not how corporate life is moving now. We're moving to role-based access to information. They don't talk about classification, but this is another way to describe the tagging of persons and the tagging of information. Because when somebody looks at the WikiLeaks and says, the Army, they're just stupid, they're also got to look at, why does the guy in their mailroom have access to their engineering drawings or their algorithms? Because he probably does. And it's the identical issue of not managing role-based access to information. The second thing, sticking with the government before I go on to something else, is I believe strongly, and I'm going to argue this, I do argue this in my forthcoming book, that there need to be, the organizations that need to be really secret need to be really secret. And this is such a different culture from moving information around rapidly that I think they have to be separated. I believe that we classify dramatically too much information. The example y'all gave about, I'm coming back to my roots, I'm here in California, I'm going back to the y'all. We used to try cases down in Western District in North Carolina. My wife used to give me a hard time when I'd come back because the jury talk came out very different. The idea that the problem you described with OSINT, for example, is why the best open source information analysis doesn't take place in the government. It takes place insofar as we buy it from contractors who don't have to work in these idiotic conditions. Now, but I just happen to have a list of some other issues on what I think, why we're not dealing with this better and what we might do. The government's really disorganized. I was writing a month before last in the communications of the ACM, looking at the number of times the government since 1991, Bush 1, was declaring, well, we had a real emergency now with our penetrability of our networks. And it's the same thing over and over and over and over again. And we have an uncoordinated government. There are certain specific things that we could do as well. We don't use our purchasing rules, the federal acquisition regulations and the DFAR, in order to drive information security into what the government purchases, which is a real market driver. If you want to know when the Congress gets really serious about this problem, they'll start using the tax code to create incentives for information security. Anytime the Congress is really serious about changing something, the tax code changes. There's been no talk about that yet. We'd isolate our electric grid. The North American, the FERC, the NERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and the NERC, which is the North American Energy Reliability Commission, I think. It's a cascading series of deference, represents a cascading series of deference down to the local utilities and generators who don't really want to be regulated in any way and don't understand the extent to which they are vulnerable. Even our official government reports are beginning to say that. Our grid is not resilient, it's not robust, and it's not recoverable. The argument counter is that they're really good on safety. They are really good on safety. But they are hyper-optimized, and I think we are skirting with a very dangerous situation with our grid.
So Joel, at the risk of
Yeah.
depriving
go ahead.
this group of the rest of your
read the
brilliant
book, yeah.
solutions, I'll ask you
Yeah.
to give us the quick version
Yeah,
so that
okay.
Walter can answer, because I know that folks have questions.
All right, here's what I think. We've got to deal with botnets, and I'll give you one other thing. The real issue is now coming up on the international control. While we're looking at all this privacy stuff, the Russians, the Chinese, and our friends the Zimbabweans are arguing that it constitutes aggression under international law to penetrate the information spaces of other countries with real information. This is where the argument's going internationally, and why the ITU is now a very dangerous organization.
Thank you. Walter, do you
Well,
think we have a problem that we need to address, or
Well, you've got a problem. I don't have a problem. I make one observation. Since this is a law school, I have to make reference. I got a law degree 10 years ago. But one of the more interesting cases that I got involved in was the Winnow Lee case, the Los Alamos scientist who downloaded nuclear secrets, put them on disks, and took them out of a highly classified area. And when he was, essentially this is the old argument about bad cases make bad law, when he was arrested and put away in solitary confinement, it became a political issue as against a legal issue. And so there was a great deal of sympathy, originally because the thought was that he was accused of delivering nuclear secrets to the Red China, I guess it was in those days. And everybody was so wound up about it because the Republicans actually saw it as one of the impeachment positions they were taking against the Clinton administration for allowing this leak to take place. And when his court case came up, there was a lot of sympathy for him. And in fact, the scientists at Los Alamos went in and testified factually that the tapes that he took out of the lab, classified portion of the lab, the computer tapes had no markings on them. Technically, they weren't classified. And the judge was so appalled by the incarceration originally and that discovery that he was released. And most people think that he committed no crime at all. And the fact is he pled guilty to a felony. And what's worse about it is that he had actually worked in the Taiwan equivalent of Los Alamos in the summer without telling his bosses, and he was paid for that in a bank account in Hawaii. And they didn't know about it till after he was debriefed as part of his plea agreement. The only reason I know about it is because I was told about it and then cited for contempt for not telling who the source was that told me about it. But the basic part of it is you've got a classification system that here are the technical secrets to our 10 most valuable strategic weapons. And nobody's ever found those tapes. And because of the political atmosphere that arose out of that case, nobody wants to touch it. So that's just another thing you got to worry about, and that is you have material that is classified, but kept in such a classified area that they don't officially, legally classify.
Well, and Walter made reference to being held in contempt for failing to reveal his source. I will say that is one of the areas in which there seems to be still a very effective way of keeping secrets. Reporters with regard to their confidential sources. And I think it's because they largely use the wazir's ears that John referred to.
Well, you're not on the lam now, are you?
But I want to open it up now for questions. But I will note that the question of, so given this scenario, what is to be done? The responses were really largely, here's how we can do a better job of keeping secrets. And I do think we need to spend at least as much, if not more, energy thinking about here's how we live with fewer secrets. Here's how we learn to do business differently. Here's how we learn to operate in a way in which we don't need those secrets. And John sort of
But you're not going to drive it. You're not going to drive us to no secrets, are you? Will you back off that?
Well, we'll see. It's not a question of whether I will drive us to it or whether it's where I think we ought to go. It's a question of where is the world taking us. And I think you can't introduce the rigor that you need to address this and to learn to operate without secrets unless you go through at least the mental exercise in every case of saying, let's assume I cannot keep this a secret. If folks are saying we need to keep this a secret. I think you have to sort of say then, let's assume that we can't keep it a secret. Let's assume our adversary or our competitor in business knows this information. How would we deal with that? What would we do differently? And that's an important part of dealing with the world in which we live.
Our favorite, let me just add to that, one of our favorite examples on this commission, the review group that Suzanne and I were on, Denny Blair of the DNI was admiral who was head of the Pacific Command, and he came to our meeting. We were talking about this very issue, and I said to him, or Suzanne said to him, now that you're head of the Director of National Intelligence, you were head of Pacific Command, you may or may not know now whether, you may now know, what you may not have known then, that some government, maybe the Chinese, maybe someone else, may have the entire military plan that you would invoke if there was a situation in Taiwan. I think it's classified top secret, so. And he sort of grimaced, he didn't say yes or no, and I said, if that were true, and you knew that when you were in PACOM, what would you do? And he said, well, we have a new plan. He sort of fell right into the trap, which is, if you had a new plan, the last one you had was the best plan, so you're going to have another plan. Well, that's not quite fair, because the new plan is founded in the fact that I know they know, but it takes you down the Spaulding rabbit hole here.
Questions? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Beth Berman, and I live here in Durham. And I wonder if anyone has ever made the argument that we should continue, in fact, over-classifying documents and having this huge, unmanageable mass of classified material, because any foreign power attempting then to steal classified information would presumably be pretty confused itself as to what was important and what isn't.
It's interesting. The corollary argument has been made, which is to say that you can hide important information in a openly in a deluge of information. This sort of notion of practical obscurity, perhaps, and I think Walter sort of effectively put that one to rest. But I haven't heard that flip side.
I think what you proposed works very well with the adversaries, the Yemeni intelligence service, but it ain't going to work against the Russians or the Chinese, who, let's be honest here, they're into every unclassified system they want to be into. That's not the issue, because it's easy. But even the classified ones, they get to decide, what do I want to know? If it's weapons design, I know where to look, so I don't have to go mine the mountain. So it will work for one, but it won't confuse the two or three that are the only ones we really care about, actually.
You know, there are different classes of, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The different
I'm just getting the microphone.
There are different classes of secrets. I think it's safe to predict that as to certain kinds of information which will have a shorter and shorter shelf life, that speed rather than secrecy will be the coin of the realm. But that's not true of other classes of secrets, including, for example, your crypto, the RSA stuff, which may move, but it's not a secret. It's a key to a whole lot of secrets. As long as there's a premium on knowing things that somebody else doesn't know, people are going to try to keep secrets. I mean, whether you're a washing machine salesman or a car dealer or somebody negotiating across the table a corporate transaction or an ambassador, there are things that will be kept secret for some time, but maybe not so long. Now, in corporate life, what you're starting to see is as people choose different methods of protecting intellectual property, deciding, for example, not to patent certain things because they need to get first to market's more important than being secret. We're going to see more of that in the government, although the analogy doesn't fit perfectly. But I go back to what I said before. I think in order to keep some things secret that need to be so, at least for a while, we've got to really separate organizationally the organizations that are doing that from all this open source stuff, which is going to become more and more important. And that is, by the way, a reversion to a historical norm. You know, it's only from the 20th century that it seemed that governments have had some advantage in keeping secrets, and that had to do partly with cryptography, which became cryptography became a branch of advanced mathematics. When that happened, there were only governments that could deal with that sort of problem. Also, surveillance became highly technological. I mean, there was only 2 governments in the world that could put a satellite in orbit for a long time. Now, you can buy commercial satellite. You don't have to buy it, you get a Google Earth. You can buy it even better. So that the reversion to the narrowing of the gap between governmental and private capabilities is actually moving quite dramatically. All that's going to contribute to it.
Yeah.
The suggestion that you just declassify everything and then no one can find anything is well, it's been tried in civil litigation to discovery for many, many years. I worked for one corporation. We used to pride ourselves in one case where we would we would publish every day how many tons of documents we had made available for discovery that day. It doesn't really work anymore because people have come up with computer programs that basically mine that. You don't have to have someone reading each individual document. Everything's scanned, everything's then run through the program, and that's picked out. Then it becomes basically open, an open source. I mean, we need to get more aggressively serious about protecting this. Well, not to say the Chinese are doing it right, but the Chinese are doing it more aggressively. They've hardened a lot of their communication stuff, so it isn't sent over the air anymore. They sponsor a competition to basically, a state-sponsored or semi-state-sponsored competition to basically infiltrate our infrastructure and award prizes for people doing it. And we need to take it more seriously, and maybe what we need to do is go to Atlanta and talk to the Coca-Cola people, because they've managed to keep their formula secret for 100 years.
Or so they would have us believe. Yeah, here. Beth.
You said you wanted some solutions. In 1993, I was the lead software assurance engineer on Star Wars. I'm also an old NSAer and then later an attorney. We, for a very small sum, I think it was $25,000, we employed several professors and we looked at the criticality of Star Wars. And along the way, we looked at the criticality of security. And we are first, because the way you look at criticality, security should have the same basic rules to secure your house as to secure a computer system. And we went through this and we determined that 3 things that are required to secure anything are environment of separation, rules and procedures, and audit. And depending on how well you do those things, it depends on the criticality of the thing that you're trying to secure. So you have procedural criticality versus functional criticality. We tried this, it worked incredibly well. The problem with WikiLeaks is something that we saw in NSA. We were really heavy into spending a lot of money on the environment of separation. In the 1990s, Mr. Taylor here was in charge of it. We did a lot of work on trying to make machines that would separate, that would stay secure. It didn't work. We forgot about the other 2 issues, rules and procedures, which is really cheap. You just have to define it and keep them in place, and audit. And I would contend that WikiLeaks came about because there were no rules and procedures and there was no audit to determine that. And we have seen this. We have taken these rules and we have used them in law. We wrote papers on, because we're Florida lawyers, Bush v. Gore, and the voting machines. And as a matter of fact, one of our papers was used in North Carolina to update their laws. And it's based on these very simple things. Environment of separation, rules and procedures that must be there. It must be there, and audit. We've used it in court on breathalyzers. You can use this in anything, and we've gotten away from it because it was too easy and too ritzy to spend a lot of money and time on the separation issue, and we forgot about the other stuff. And that's my comment.
Can I comment?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I agree with you that there's, and as I indicated, we're already doing a lot more in the audit. When I said things are being done, there's something in the neighborhood already for this fiscal year, $60 million, a drop in the bucket, where we're going up to hundreds and hundreds to do audit and monitoring, and so that's well in chain. And the rules and procedures are very much up front because it was easy, didn't have any. I mean, literally, the State Department had all this data. They were responsible for it. They owned the server, they owned the data, theirs and other people's, and they had no attempt, zero. people should be penalized, but of course no one will be punished because we don't do that in government. And the separation, the environment of separation, all that will work for the disgruntled employee, the Private Bradley Manning. I submit, and I'm quite confident in what I say, that a skilled intelligence service with an insider, that's known as the insider threat, will beat all this all the time. It may take them a little bit longer, but that's not going to get us through the problem of the penetration of systems otherwise.
I also worked at Paycom, and we.
Did you know they had your war plans?
Yeah. I didn't do that. I was doing security. And what we did there as a kind of test bed, we had really, really intelligent people that pretended to be the insider.
Red team attacks.
Yes, red team attacks. And I contend that we're doing them as a side, and we need to do them as a reality a lot of
Every
the time.
time you have a red team attack that succeeds, you have a new way to beat the red team. So they're always going to, the bad guys, the one that does the
Yes.
inventing, they're going to be ahead.
I agree
You
with
can't
you.
beat it on that page.
But at least we're only one step behind and not 1,000 steps
Rather than
behind.
1,000, got it.
This is for you, Walter.
This is for you, Walter.
No, this is a question about open source information. In the 90s, I worked for the United States Information Agency and then later for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, doing collecting public opinion research abroad, doing focus groups, and doing analysis of the media. And while I was at USIA, of course, this was all open source, and it was open and available to the public for the most part. The minute I went to INR, it was classified, and I fought hard to keep it open source. But I guess my question isn't so much my poor job and what happened to it, but what goes on in the intelligence community? I think there's a mindset that says because you're in INR, everything in here has to be classified. And this may be true of other aspects of the intelligence community, and it's a mindset rather than or at least it seems to me to be that way. And although at the time at the CIA there was just chatter every minute about how important open source information was, but I swear to God I never saw one example of it. And I would like to get your views on that. Thank you.
Well, my views are a lot like your views. We are dealing with a cultural proclivity to, number one, avoid mistakes, because you know, people trained in the intelligence business understand the mosaic theory, and it's hard to know what little piece of information is going to help somebody else complete a puzzle, and so nobody wants to make a mistake. That's a good faith problem. Then you have a cultural disposition to prefer classified information and think it's more important because it's classified. This is a problem both with the producer of intelligence and the consumers, who also, I mean, not just the intelligence agencies, but the politicians. Hey, if it's classified, it must be the real juice. I'll give you a story, you know, it drives John crazy, but back during the last French presidential election, I did a little experiment. I was reading the New York Times and the Post and the Journal, and I was reading Le Monde, and I was looking at what was coming across my computer on the French election. There was nothing coming across my computer that you couldn't read in the New York Times and the Journal and whatnot. And none of it was as good as if we'd have paid a grad student to translate what was coming across in Le Monde and just to digest it. I mean, pick another French paper if you like Figaro better. I mean, the point was, why was it classified? It was classified confidential, which is basically means, well, we can't really defend it, but let's sort of keep it under wraps. That's a screwball, you know, level of classification. But now it's not what they said. Now it's what we think. And so that's another, you know, reason. But we are dealing also with a subset of the intelligence business that does. Let me just back up a little bit of a tutorial here. You get original classification authorities, and then you get derivative classifications. But not everybody has original classification authority. That's the people who are developing the information. Then they pass it on, and one is then obliged to adopt that. And if I write a memorandum that relies on something MacGaffin has previously, assuming he had that authority, has classified it, I'm obliged to classify it the same way. That's a derivative classification. The people who do original classification and their staffs really tend to be, I don't think I'm not impugning anybody's integrity, but this is a rigid mindset. It's a subset of a group of a culture that's intended to be closed to start with. So we've got overclassify all kinds of stuff. And when you get your computer, because this doesn't happen on paper anymore, it comes over your computer. And so you get a bunch of boxes automatically. And if you put unclassified FOUO, nothing happens. I mean, but if you put unclassified and not put FOUO, you get questioned about it. You got another couple of boxes to click. If you made a mistake here. So the inclination, I mean, the system is designed to want to make you keep things under wrap.
And what we ought to be doing is shifting that burden. It ought to be harder to classify than to not classify stuff. Brian, you get the last question, and hopefully a short one.
Short question. We talk about us being victimized by the Chinese, by the Russians, by others, in terms of their knowing our secrets. Of course, one way to neutralize their knowing our secrets is to know their secrets. So can one assume, this need not come to a formal answer, but can one assume that we are as aggressive and as successful in penetrating their systems and getting their secrets as they are in getting ours?
Yeah, so of course, John and Joel won't answer that question, but I will just say.
You have a clearance, by the way?
I do, but I will just say, based not on access to anything classified, that one clue about this is that the Defense Department does not seem the least bit interested in any discussion about trying to enter into international discussions that would limit activities in cyberspace. So my experience has been over the years that when a new technology, or new in this case maybe a new domain, but I think when new technologies come on the scene, the Defense Department starts out with the assumption that they can dominate the use of that technology. So whether it's nuclear weapons or it's space, weapons in space, that they're very reluctant to enter into discussions about how we might, all agree to limit our activities there because they think they can dominate that use of that technology. And it's only when they begin to realize that their adversaries or competitors have caught up with them or bested them in that environment that they begin to think, well, maybe now it's time to talk about ways to impose limits. They are not interested in that in cyberspace, so that may be a clue.
Whether or not they can do what Brian said.
I'm not saying whether they can do what Brian's saying. I'm just saying that might be a clue.
Okay, Suzanne, thank you very much, and thank you, panelists, for a great panel.